what was interesting yesterday, what he said was he didn't necessarily repeat the word tariff. He said we'd be looking at sanctions and
Mm.
maybe even tariffs. So he may be wavering on actually what the consequences are, and he may be changing his mind about what he does after 10 to 12 days.
I'm joined now by the Times' World Affairs editor, Catherine Philp, and we'll move on to Ukraine in a second, Catherine. But just today, Sir Keir Starmer's going to be hosting a cabinet meeting about when the UK should recognise a Palestinian state. There seems to be a growing sense of urgency about recognising Palestine as a state. We have been here before, though, not least in 2008. Do we think this time will be any different?
Well, hi, Tom. First of all, it is a manifesto pledge by the Labour Party and has been for some time their policy to recognise a Palestinian state. I think the issue here is that Starmer has previously been quite resistant to doing this unilaterally and has said he only wants to do it if it's part of a process that would actually lead somewhere. But there are other countries who are having this meeting this week, looking at ways of doing this. And obviously, France has already announced, Emmanuel Macron has already announced as the first G7 country to make that pledge that it would recognise Palestinian statehood. And Starmer has come under increasing pressure from his own party and even his cabinet. At least a third of his cabinet are backing this. Now, I think it's not an accident that not only do we have this meeting, international meeting on this, but also the fact that he met with Donald Trump yesterday. And obviously this came up. And Trump didn't sound as resistant to the idea I mean, obviously America's not going to do it itself, but he didn't sound so objectionable to the idea of Britain going ahead. And previously we've heard Marco Rubio say, this would be a slap in the face to the Israeli victims of October 7th. But Trump gave a very different message yesterday, much more emollient one, saying that it wouldn't lead to a falling out with Britain if Starmer were to do that. So I think that it is now on the table, and it's a consideration for whether Britain might do this in September at the UN General Assembly, which is when France is planning to go ahead with it formally.
And you talk about the Prime Minister wanting to do it as part of a process. Do we know which Palestinian groups are involved in that process? Because ultimately, you're going to need to get a legitimately recognised Palestinian body to be the new government of a Palestinian state. And it's hard to see quite who that is and how you bring a body on board that the UK, that the US and then eventually Israel can actually recognise as a legitimate source of authority.
Well, there is a recognised legitimate source of authority, which is the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. That is being recognised under previous peace processes that, that still awarded this standing as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Now, its current incarnation is essentially the Palestinian Authority, which is discredited really amongst the Palestinian people itself. So, yes, I think you would have to be looking at a new government, but the PLO already has that standing, so that the basis of that government is clear. Obviously, they would be looking to an eventual democratically elected government, but I think this is really much more of a symbolic move, or would be a symbolic move, essentially to recognise the Palestinians' inalienable right to statehood, to self-determination, the same recognition that was given to the Jewish people with the founding of the State of Israel. And there are already 144 members of the UN who recognise Palestinian statehood, and it has observer status at the UN, so it has a representative there. It's not actually quite as complicated as it sounds.
And it's that interesting, well, I suppose, tension between the the principle and the practicalities of Palestinian statehood and where they do and don't align. I do want to talk to you about Ukraine, Catherine, because one of the less expected announcements from his trip to Turnberry was Donald Trump giving Vladimir Putin 10 to 12 days to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine. Just to give some context to listeners, 2 weeks ago, he'd given him 50 days, i.e. early September, which is still 35 days from now.
Yeah.
So he's threatening sanctions if the Russian leader doesn't play ball. What's prompted this shifting deadline?
Well, I think it's frankly a bit of his patience running out, and he's I think presumably aware that Vladimir Putin's is succeeding in making him look a bit stupid, frankly, because he's tended to believe that Putin is interested in peace and come off those phone calls very positive, and then immediately sees Putin attack major Ukrainian cities with missiles as soon as he's spoken to him about this. And I mean, it's widely recognized that as soon as that 50-day deadline was given, Russia then simply proceeded to go hell for leather and get as far as it possibly could on the battlefield before that time expired. Now, what isn't clear is exactly what Trump thinks he's going to, is suggesting he would do after those 10 to 12 days. So when he gave the 50-day deadline, he was talking about at the end of that imposing 100% tariffs on countries that, sort of secondary sanctions in effect, on countries that buy oil from Russia. Now, that would involve not only strategic and economic rivals like China, but it would involve people who the US is, cozying up to as a bulwark against China, so places like India. So it could be very complicated. Now, I think what was interesting yesterday, what he said was he didn't necessarily repeat the word tariff. He said we'd be looking at sanctions and maybe even tariffs. So he may be wavering on actually what the consequences are, and he may be changing his mind about what he does after 10 to 12 days. But I think it's certainly clear that, he is frustrated by this. He did say he was going to solve this problem, and he hasn't. He's also not getting much leeway on ending the conflict in Gaza, which is another promise he made. So he's very aware, and he's very, very invested in this idea that he's a president who will bring peace, and he's rather keen on a Nobel Peace Prize. I think we're seeing both his patience running out, and also perhaps even some of the Russia hawks in the administration taking a more prominent role. So Marco Rubio, who is now added national security advisor to his rather long list of jobs, including Secretary of State. He's more of a Russia hawk than some of the others. And Steve Witkoff, who had been dealing with the Russians, is now really much more caught up in the Gaza brief, which has left it to the original envoy who was intended for Ukraine, Russia, who is Keith Kellogg, and again is much more of a hawk on the Russian side. So there's been a bit of a personnel shift as well.
Well, we will see quite what happens after those 10 to 12 days. Predicting Donald Trump is always a tricky job. Catherine, thank you so much for enlightening us there. That's Catherine Philp, the Times' World Affairs editor, talking us through, the two biggest stories in the world, Ukraine and Gaza.